Now, the first situation we're going to bring to the table here, we've got someone coming in from a company and they just have e-learning content that they need to be translated. They're sort of ground zero. They don't know anything. What do they need to know? What's the first steps that they should be thinking about?
So the first thing we need to know about localization of e-learning is having the right authoring tool. Ideally, you should have some sort of tool that can export and import content for translation easily. So for instance, there's tools like Lessonly, which kind of require translation to be done on the platform itself because you can't export it or import it quite easily. Rise, however, can do that, Articulate Rise, and one of my clients, they were able to switch over to that, and rather than have in-house translators who were not actually translators, they just happen to speak the language, they're now able to have actual translators translate that content and localize it correctly. And another important feature to make note of is whether a platform actually offers dynamic resizing, so that languages that have longer words or sentence structures, like German, for instance, instead of being cut off where English would cut off at character limits, it actually resizes the page so that a whole word can fit. Also, having a platform that can be adapted to whether the audience uses mobile or PC or tablet to actually access that content is pretty useful to have.
Okay. And you mentioned having like in-house translators there who are not translators. Is that quite common?
Sometimes in the initial stages when they haven't had a localization plan, that can happen. And it's not always a bad thing if they know what they're doing, but you can have, it's best to have someone that's dedicated to the actual translation job to translate the content and localize it.
They may have someone who speaks German, but they may not have anyone for French and Italian. And then, you know, the process doesn't work anymore and they have to look outside. And that's when they realize that they can't export the content, for example. So, you know, thinking ahead, will this work for, you know, another 5 languages? Is this just a, you know, a short-term solution, but not a long-term plan? I think that would help if they consider that.
Okay. What's the difference when you're just creating for one language compared to?
Well, I mean, I think when you are thinking about launching a module in different markets or in different languages, you have to think about your module or your assets in general. If they were created originally with the thought of launching them into different markets, then great, you have a good part of the job completed because you have thought of all the little things and all the moving parts in that module or that video that you want to localize, and you know that things can change. But if, for example, you didn't think about those things when you were developing or creating your assets, then you might need to go back into your English modules to make some changes and make it localizable. There's things like focusing on repeated text and sentences that can be used in many contexts. Like, I mean, it's useful to paraphrase, and it might be necessary when you are doing things like assessments or quizzes when you want to test the understanding of a lesson. But there are some sentences that will be repeated across the module, and that there are some concepts that don't need to be rephrased. So repeating those sentences, I mean, some examples might be next, or you've reached the end of the lesson, this is your result, things like that. Simple but complete sentences that can be used in repeated scenarios that can help reduce the cost of localization greatly. I mean, these are things that are very repeated throughout e-learning. I think some other concepts that you will need to take into account when creating that module, and if you haven't thought of that before creating it, then you might need to go back and look into it, would be multimedia, like minimizing the amount of videos or images that you need to use, because I mean sometimes they're necessary, so your modules are engaging and people want are looking forward to using them. But this also brings an extra layer of engineering and questions about the best way of localizing them, from deciding if you want to localize an image or just leave it in English, or to decide between if you want subtitles or voiceover when you localize videos. That's also something that will have a great impact on your costs and your budget.
So we've got this company coming in with their course, and I can imagine often what the situation is people are like, oh yes, I've got to put all of the interactive elements, I've got to do all of the videos because that's what we want from it. What sort of questions are you going to be asking them? What should they be looking at the content that they've already got in English?
Well, the first question I always ask is if you have the open files. That's the most common one, because sometimes companies might take a screenshot of a website, for example, and that's not a localizable element because it's just an image. So you will need an open file, or if you have an alternative for that specific market, that those questions are the ones that define the engineering cost down the line. So it's the best question to ask on those multimedia assets. Then I would say also, like, the big question: do you want it localized or not? Is it something that is essential for the learning outcome? Do you need that specific screenshot to be localized? And if the answer is no, then well, you can just leave those assets untouched. And if the answer is yes, then what are the parameters you need? For example, if it's a video, do you really need it to be voiced? Maybe subtitles are enough. Do you want to have different versions for each market, or just you need a hosting platform for that video that can allows you to upload different subtitle files?
I think to reiterate Irene's point, I think it's often about scalability, that what somebody might do if they're just creating e-learning for one language, normally in English, like you say, they might use all sorts of different features and quizzes and animations and interactions. But when you have to scale that up, and it might be 5 languages or 50 languages, that cost increases as well. So it's thinking about that when you're designing those elements. So is it a real video with actors, or can you do that in a way that is more efficient but gives the same kind of learner experience and is still effective in that learning message? Can you get it across in a different way that's much easier to localize and much cheaper to localize? So instead of using real actors and having to potentially re-record that situation entirely, can you do it in an animation? And just have voiceovers that change. Animation works really well because you have a lot of options for extending frames, for example, so that you can fit the voiceover properly into that time and that space. Whereas with real video, that's much more difficult. So things like that, like Irene says, subtitles or voiceovers, what do your markets need, and how can you design content to make it scalable?
Along the same lines, I would say using images which contain text in them. You know, is the text in the image essential, or can it be actually written out as part of the course? Because you will not have to localize an image if you just use text that can be edited by the translator. So that will save the cost of having to replace the image in all the localized courses.
I think thinking one of the other areas is around the layout and the design. So if content has been designed for English and with the English content in mind, it might just fit in the available space. But a language like German, for example, the content will probably be longer. In Chinese or Japanese, it will be shorter. So if you make your layout and your design work for those languages, it can remove steps that might otherwise be necessary to fix things to make it work in the languages. So moving text boxes or resizing elements to make them fit it's wasted effort and it's wasted cost, and you can engineer that out. You can remove the need for that by designing it with other languages in mind right from the beginning.
I guess once you've got, 5 languages under your belt, you've already got that scalability in mind, hopefully. What's the jump? What, as a provider, like, what do you need to get that person from only thinking about training in English to thinking about it scaling in a scalable way?
I think it's just what you've said. It's a mindset shift about thinking first and foremost about localization, not thinking I'm designing for English and everything else is an afterthought. That when you design in English, that's one of the many languages that this will go into. And having in mind that you're not only taking that English to serve your English speaking audience and your learners, but that needs to work for all of the other markets and all of your other learners as well. So another example might be using more simplified plain language that avoids ambiguity, that's easy to understand and can really give you the best shot at ensuring your message is understood and learners are able to take on board the content itself, rather than using puns, for example, or jokes. These generally localize really badly. More simple, concise, shorter sentences that are easy to understood and that completely avoid ambiguity make it much easier. So again, it's that mindset and having those things in mind from the outset.
And I guess a lot of companies are going to be going, okay, well, I can scale it just by adding machine translation and AI voices and all of that sort of stuff. How possible is that? And what are the things you need to know?
Yeah, machine translation can be a very useful tool, especially in terms of cost and how quick of a turnaround you want. However, there are a lot of risks when it comes to the quality of those translations, especially when there's maybe a very it's called complex type of grammar structures, as in like Japanese, for instance, where it really matters how you say something and in what order. MT is not going to really understand that. So ideally, when you start thinking about using MT, you want to write things in a very short and succinct manner, and you don't want to really have any complexities really from the get-go. If even with a simple source, you can also have translators post-edit the machine translation to make sure that the style that your brand wants and the specific product names aren't mistranslated at the end.
You mentioned Japanese there, and one of the things that's interesting about learning is that it's different all over the world. And how do you take the learning needs of the different people in the different cultures into account when you're localizing the same course over multiple different markets?
Yes, I think the obvious statement that we all think about is people want to think the content is for them. I mean, even if it seems really an obvious sentence, it is really important to have that in mind when at the core of the designing process. When you want to launch an asset or a module in different markets, your demographics and cultural experiences will change. And it's really important to think about that before creating the text, scenarios, and even characters. I think, for example, using Caucasian models when localizing for Asia, it's unlikely to work for them. If you're only thinking about this when planning for localization, this means that you have skipped a step. You will have to think about reshooting images or getting new stock images for different markets. If, for example, you use animations, I think it would be useful to think about that when with the development artist on different models and animations for different markets. This might add some time to the development process, but it will deem essential down the line when it is time to change those designs and it's time to change the animations for the different countries. I think Another point is avoid culture-specific references like sport analogies. I think the American football versus European football is a big one, but maybe that culture has a different predominant sport like cricket, I don't know, or softball. And by thinking about this, I mean, maybe you still need to use that analogy, but you're thinking about the alternatives and you will avoid headaches down the line. I think the other big point is humor and idioms. They are likely to sound clever and engage in one market, and it is possible that they can be localized and work in some other markets, but it's likely to fail on most of them, or sound clunky when localizing.
And as teachers, you know, the people that generate learning content tend to be teachers, and metaphors and those type of analogies are always part of teaching. How can you change the sort of the mind of your teachers? How do you stop them from thinking about things that are only suitable to their own culture?
Yeah, I think that's something as we've said before, it's about shifting that mindset, but sometimes it's also about thinking of what you're saying. I mean, maybe you want to use that analogy and that can be fine, but you have to think about what you're really meaning, because that information will also allow the linguist or the localization people to just make that change and make it sound natural in that other language.
Get your LSP involved in the design process, and they can advise on internationalization steps. So we could look at the content and advise on which elements potentially would not translate very well or work very well in the certain markets. So it's something that you know, we can advise on if the client would like to preempt those problems coming up in the future.
I think as well, we also have cultural considerations, but I think there are technical considerations as well, or different learner behaviors that we need to account for. So some people might use Android phones instead of iPhones in a certain market. And if your course hasn't been designed to work on that platform, then people aren't going to be able to use it. So are people working on mobile devices, or are they on PCs? And this can vary across markets. So I think having those conversations with your audience and your markets initially to figure out what do people need, what do they actually want, so that you don't end up in a scenario that a client of ours unfortunately has had, where you build your content and it just doesn't work for that market because they can't access it technology-wise.
The same situation may occur to do with people having different levels of access to internet. And in some countries, perhaps people are in the habit of downloading content on their home network so that they can watch it while they're traveling, rather than consume things on the go, because maybe internet access is expensive or is not very good, very slow. So these are all the things that you should consider up front and understand your audience and how they will consume the content.